Hello, this is James Mitchell, and we are back from another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Supreme Court sides with woman claiming anti-straight job discrimination from WashingtonPost.com, and that was posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I don't think the government should be telling people who they can and can't discriminate against. I do think, you shouldn't be discriminating against people based on their sexuality, race, etc., etc. But ultimately, I think private businesses should be able to choose for whoever they should be able to discriminate or not. That doesn't mean I necessarily like it. But I believe that it comes down to freedom of association rather than government coerced acceptance. It's like when Lester Maddox refuses to serve black people at his restaurant. I personally don't care for that, but he should have every right to do so if he wants to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then next we have federal bill that would ban hemp THC nationwide passed by House committee from the marijuanaherald.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's crossed from the law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think, the libertarian position is you shouldn't be banning anything. You need to allow people to use whatever materials they want to, regardless of how you feel about them. So I personally would disagree with this bill, but ultimately, as I've stated in the past, the state can ultimately declare anything it wants to be banned material and act accordingly, since it has a monopoly on the use of force. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Elon Musk drops really big bomb alleging Donald Trump is in Epstein files from IrishStar.com, posted from Doctor Who 07. And yeah, I personally don't think that's too surprising. It's like George Carlin says, it's a big club and you ain't in it. I personally won't be surprised if Elon was in there as well. It seems like all the elites are in there, and Donald Trump and Elon are both very much elites. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Happy Belated Killdozer Day, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and they added, I know I missed it, but it should be celebrated. And yeah, personally, I do think the Killdozer was a tad more on the violent side, but I'm glad that, he didn't kill anyone. He thought that the state had wronged him, so, he got in his juiced up bulldozer, which he called the Killdozer, and I don't think he called it the Killdozer, that's what the media more so called it, and then he went after government property with it, and yeah, ultimately, I like his quote, reasonable men must sometimes do unreasonable things, or something like that. It's like reasonable men sometimes be forced to do unreasonable things, and yeah, sometimes, if the state's just driven you crazy, ultimately, you can justify doing whatever you want to. I personally don't know if I'd do the whole killdozer thing, but if you want to justify having a killdozer and running into government properties with it, justify doing whatever you want to. Just be aware you're probably not going to make it out like Marvin Heemeyer, the killdozer driver, did, because the state has legal monopoly on the use of force, so they can do whatever they want to stop you from hitting their buildings. Then we have I'm Slipping into Tankyism from Andrew Quaxton, and that's a tweet from Marl Parks at Bear Left, who said, you do start to appreciate why Lennon and Stalin just shot everybody. And then they added, I used to consider myself an ANCAP, but around 2020 I have to do over towards more libertarian socialism ideas. I just want maximum freedom and quality of life for everyone, regardless of left or right, as we become more divided, and I see the other side so foaming at the mouth with stupidity and evil. I cannot but wonder how we could ever form a functioning society if the other side, I get why a lot of right-wing libertarians can get behind an authoritarian conservative if they see that as the only way to get closer to division. As leftists, I just don't know if mutual aid and dual power is going to be enough. I say this not because I want to sway you all away from libertarianism, but because I hope someone here can sway me back. And yeah, I think it's interesting how I was banned from the subreddit last year for being mean to a gay pedophile. I guess that's what the mod said. But this guy can say, oh, Lenin and Stalin just shot everybody, and you should appreciate that, and the Soviet Union did nothing wrong, and that's completely fine. It's just going to show on Reddit, if you disagree with the Alpha Mafia at all, it's banned, but if you say the Soviet Union did nothing wrong, oh, that's completely fine. And that just goes to show you how ideologically biased Reddit is. Regardless, I think this post is interesting. I definitely do think, we need to ultimately, I think the libertarian position isn't libertarian socialism. I think socialism is forced collectivism, and like 99% of libertarian socialists definitely put the socialist before the libertarian. But I think that ultimately the libertarian position shouldn't be for collectivism at all. It should be for each individual to have to own themselves and justify whatever they want to. I think both libertarian socialism and a lot of anarcho-capitalism does usually end up being more collectivist than individualist, and that's something that I personally don't really care for. As libertarians, we need to support individualism above all else, and that definitely isn't what libertarian socialism is. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we're going to be covering the entire city with drones. San Francisco Police Department accepts billionaire's $9.4 million gift from missionlocal.org, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, as I stated previously, I don't really care for the state or the states or whatever the tools the state uses, but ultimately the state has the legal monopoly of force to use whatever tools it wants, and that does include drones. And I personally don't really care for drones constantly spying on me. But ultimately, if the state wants to justify constantly spying on me for drones or whatever other resources it has, ultimately, it has the legal monopoly on force to justify whatever it wants to. Look at the NSA. The Edward Snowden now. The NSA is spying on Americans in 2013, and they're probably still doing it. It's probably more sophisticated than it was back then. So ultimately, the state, if it wants to justify spying on its own citizens, I personally don't really care for that. But, they can justify whatever they feel like, since they have the monopoly on the legal use of force. Then we have Tom Holman says Trump had been sending National Guard to LA over ICE protests from RollingStone.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I don't think the president should be able to send the state's National Guard to any war zone without a declaration of war. That's what the Defend the Guard Act, the Libertarian Party, likes to push states. That's why we need to pass the Defend the Guard Act. The president has way too much power and authority to send the National Guard wherever he likes. And yeah, I personally don't really care for it. With that being said, I don't really care for the LA riots either. It's kind of reminds me of the Eastern Front of the Second World War. It's Nazis versus Soviets. You just only hope they can both lose. The state's probably going to win since they have the monopoly on the use of force. But I know if the rioters had their way, they would be the ones with the legal monopoly on the use of force, and it wouldn't be much better. So yeah, ultimately, I don't really care for the rioting at all. I made a post now on the Libertarian Party USA subreddit. I might read it now. Let's see. I'll read it to you guys now. Libertarian perspectives on rioting. If you're keeping up with the news out of Los Angeles, it looks like we might be in for another quote-unquote summer of love, full of riots in the cities. When it comes to riots, most people only seem to care whether the in-group or the out-group is doing them. It's why all the progressives retweeted riots are the language of the unheard in 2020, but thought that last year's riots in the UK over concerns about Muslim immigration were the worst thing ever. I personally don't care for political violence, but ultimately people will justify what they want to justify. My thoughts on the current ICE riots in LA are that when the state is fighting against annoying Reddit communists, I only wish that they could somehow both lose. It's basically the term of code of World War II. And yeah, thoughts. And yeah, that's pretty much my thoughts on that. I don't really care for riots at all. A lot of Redditors might be cheering them on, but when they end up at your front door or your backyard, suddenly you won't be so happy. And they'll come on you if they don't. The rioters would probably attack you if they thought you weren't supporting the cause enough. It's like during the French Revolution. Maximilien Robespierre was the one who was initially pushing everyone to the guillotine, and they decided no, he's not radical enough, so they ended up putting him on the guillotine. And that just goes to show you how you can always try and get as much as you can. Always think you're in the in-group, but if the in-group ultimately takes power, they'll try and out-group as much of the in-group as they possibly can. And yeah, I really don't care for that. It's like the night of the long knives when the Nazis took out a lot of people in their own party because they thought they were a threat to Hitler and his centralized power. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that, but ultimately people will justify what they justify. You just can't justify rioting, because it's against the cause you might agree with. If Californians think ICE is that bad, they can always secede from the Union and get rid of ICE completely. But, I don't think it really matters too much. I think it's just, it might just be astroturfed by the state because, a lot of the rioters have the face coverings, and those face coverings are usually marks of the feds, whether it be for Antifa or Patriot Front or any other of the radical groups, political activist groups in the U.S. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. I don't really. I hope peace can be restored as soon as possible. But ultimately, I think the rooftop Koreans and local militias should be the ones dealing with it instead of the National Guard. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have presidential memoranda to approve use of U.S. armed forces against American protesters, labeling riots as an act of rebellion from WhiteHouse.gov, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. And yeah, I don't really care for that, but ultimately, if the states wants to deploy the army against rioters, it should be able to. The state can just fight whatever it wants to since it has a legal monopoly on the use of force. So yeah, I don't. So yeah, that's my thoughts there. I don't really care for that, but if the state wants to do that, that's on them. Then we have just a typical day under the Trump regime. Never saw this under Obama or Biden. Posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the r/facepalm subreddit. And yeah, that looks like a post from the Mideast Touch subreddit. A military Black Op helicopter is unloading dozens of boxes of weapons and ammunition in Los Angeles as if they were getting ready for a major battle. And then there's a post from the Scoop. Hexif says National Guard and Marines to be deployed to support ICE in LA. And that's a tweet from Pete Hexif saying that as such. And yeah, ultimately, I don't really care for deploying the Marines or National Guard on civilians, but ultimately, sometimes, the state will justify to do what it needs to do in order to keep order. So, yeah, I personally don't really care for it, but yeah, that's my thoughts there. Then we have Trump says Elon Musk will face very serious consequences if he funds Democratic candidates from NBCNews.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that. But if the state wants to go after someone for funding candidates they don't like, that's their prerogative. It just goes to show you how you can't trust the state. Elon trusted Trump to help reduce the size of his government, but Trump just stabbed him in the back. And I told everyone, Trump, Kamala was a stab you in the front candidate, Trump's a stab you in the back candidate, and yeah, that's why you just can't trust the state regardless of who's in charge of it. Then we have Trump is using the National Guard as bait from theatlantic.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, I think everything Trump pretty much does is bait. It's like all his social media. He tries to bait people into responding to him and focusing on one thing. It's like he retweets a picture, retweets a picture of himself as a picture as the Pope, and everyone focuses on that. Then they move on to whatever the next Trump thing is. And yeah, that's pretty much what he's been doing for the past 10 years now. Next Monday marks the 10th anniversary of him going down the gold escalator and saying, I'm running for president, build the wall. They're not sending their best. And that just goes to show you how, his shtick has been working for 10 years now, and people don't realize that, it's like on Thursday, the big thing was, the Elon Trump feud. Now it's already something else. On Monday, it might be something else. You don't know. Just always move on to the next thing of Trump. And yeah, it gets tiring after a while. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.